can go ahead and get started. Welcome. Thank you all for coming. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jillian Porter, and I am an assistant professor of Russian at the University of Colorado Boulder, and I am also very happy to be working here this year as visiting assistant professor of Russian and comparative literature. And I am especially happy today to be able to welcome Dr. Harsha Ram to the Jordan Center. I know that for many of you, Harsha needs no introduction, but I do want to say a few words just to situate his talk today in the broader context of his really remarkable scholarly trajectory. So Harsha received his PhD in comparative literature from Yale University, and he's currently associate professor of Slavic languages and literatures and comparative literature at the University of California, Berkeley. His first major contribution to Russian and comparative literature was his 2003 book, The Imperial Sublime, A Russian Poetics of Empire, which received an honorable mention for the Modern Language Association's Aldo and Jean Scaglione Prize for Studies in Slavic Languages and Literatures. And with this book, Harsha established himself as a leader in the fields of Russian poetics and post-colonial studies. His finely tuned account of the relationship between 18th century Russian poetic and political history shows how Russian imperialism in the 18th century, and particularly the empire's expansion into the regions along its southwestern borders, shaped modern Russian literature and aesthetic thought. Since publishing The Imperial Sublime, Harsha has reached into ever new areas of research while remaining committed to certain key tasks of The Imperial Sublime. Two cases in point here are the two books he is currently writing. One of these, entitled The Scale of Culture, Empire, Nation, City, and the Russian-Georgian Encounter, offers a cultural history of Russian-Georgian relations in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The other, from which his talk today is drawn, explores the Russian Revolution in the context of world literature. A guiding thread throughout these projects, as well as many of Harsha's other publications on comparative romanticisms, modernisms, and modernities, is his examination of Russian literature and culture, not only in relation to the Western European traditions that have received a great deal of attention in the fields of Slavic studies and comparative literature, but also, and here's one area where Harsha's scholarship is truly pioneering, in relation to the Caucasian, more broadly Eurasian, and increasingly in his most recent works, South Asian traditions that have received but scant attention in the academy. With his expertise in aesthetic and literary theory, and his knowledge of no fewer than 11 languages, including Russian and all the usual European suspects, as well as the likes of Georgian, Hindi, Tamil, and Persian, Harsha is uniquely capable of articulating complex networks of global cultural exchange that have gone unrecognized and untheorized before him. Simply put, there really is no one like Harsha Ram. So we're all extremely lucky to have him in the field, and we're certainly fortunate to have him here today. So without further ado, I want to turn the floor over to Harsha so that he can share his paper on Khlebnikov, Tatlin, and the Utopian Geopoetics of the Russian Avant-garde.
Thank you, Jillian, for your very warm introduction, and thank you also for coming here on this improbably muggy and warm October afternoon. I was all psyched to be here during the fall, and I'm still waiting for it. So this is a talk, as you can see, called Khlebnikov, Tatlin, and the Utopian Geopoetics of the Russian Avant-garde, and I'll be explaining some of these operative terms as I move through the paper. The paper essentially, as Jillian pointed out, is part of a third book project focused on the poetics, the literary theory, and the politics of the Russian Revolution, and what that particular convergence or conjuncture of literature and politics might allow us to, or how it might allow us to rethink the problem of world literature, which has been such a central preoccupation of comparatists in the last few decades. This particular paper has three sections. The first is called Poetry and Revolution, And I begin by basically surveying a few choice examples or citations or quotations from different Russian poets in their immediate lyric response to the events of 1917, something that I think particularly appropriate given the fact that it is, of course, not the 100th, but the 101st anniversary of the Russian Revolution this month. Then I move on to discussing specifically the problem of utopia and how to think about the relationship between poetics and utopian thought with respect to the Russian Revolution, but also more broadly, the problem of utopia as it has been theorized by Western European scholars such as Louis Marin, for example, one of the foundational figures in trying to rethink the problem of early modern utopia down to the 20th century. Then I move on to the problem, which is already, in a sense, adumbrated in the title, which is the problem of geopoetics, something that I know many of you here, and Lansbury included, are interested in, the problem specifically of the poetics of the planetary or of the Earth, although how the Earth is going to be understood it remains to be seen in this particular text. I'll be talking more about that specifically in the case of Khlebnikov. And my argument essentially will be that Khlebnikov gives us a unique kind of poetic, but also epistemological vision of Eurasian space, something that he thinks both on the level of literary production and of regional cultures, but also in the mode of what I will call modernist abstraction, something I'll be coming back to in the second half of the talk. And then the final part of the talk is actually devoted to an extraordinary text that was largely buried, ignored, but briefly saw the light of day in the early 1920s when it was produced posthumously as a performance piece, as a play, if you will, by none other than Vladimir Tatlin, one of the giants of the Soviet avant-garde, one of the leading figures of Russian constructivism, who staged it no less than 3 times in Petrograd in 1923, before it was largely consigned to oblivion. And my argument will be, in fact, that alongside a few other perhaps key texts of this early period in Soviet history, such as, for example, Mayakovsky's Mysteria Bouffe, it allows us to think about the utopian as well as the planetary implications of the Russian Revolution, specifically about the way in which it tries to think Russian Eurasian space with respect to a newly conceived understanding of the planetary, understood both in spatial terms, in temporal terms, but also in linguistic terms. So many different dimensions of language and space-time that Khlebnikov allows us to think through. And then finally, I will end with a few sort of tentative conclusions about the implications of this forgotten but I think crucial text for the understanding of world literature. A much larger version of this paper is actually going to be published in a volume that hopefully will be coming out under University of Toronto Press. It's a collected volume which will be entitled Comintern Aesthetics, and my article will be the first in the volume. So if you're curious to see when it might be published, you know it's coming out relatively soon. All right, so let's begin by perhaps taking a look at a few examples of Russian poets in their response to the revolution. It's hardly surprising that almost every single Russian poet responded in some way to the events of 1917. So, for example, we have here the poet Boris Pasternak, who, I just realized I don't have the text in front of me, so I'll probably have to stand up briefly just to discuss these examples. Most of the Russian poets, in fact, responded to the Russian Revolution with a mixture of enthusiasm and dread, a convergence, if you like, that can certainly be understood in terms of a poetics of the sublime. But here we have, for example, a poem, Springtime Storm, by Boris Pasternak, written in 1917. I'll read it in Russian and then in English. «Это не ночь, не дождь, не хором, рвущийся керенский ура. Это слепящий выход на форум из катакомб безысходных вчера». No, not the night, nor the rain, nor the chorus, thundering forth Kerensky, hooray. It's the bedazzling path to the forum out of the catacombs, sealed till today. Here you can see from this particular example that Pasternak is essentially recoding the political events of February 1917 in terms of the eruption of something archaic, something perennial, something, if you like, resurrection, a form, if you like, of resurrection that is somehow erupting into the civic life of the forum of the civic life of Russia at the beginning of 1917. Another example, perhaps even better known, Alexander Blok's celebrated the 12. Blok's organizing metaphor, of course, as many of you will know, in the 12 is, of course, the idea of the Russian Revolution as a blizzard, a kind of elemental force that is sweeping everything aside. Так идут державным шагом, позади голодный пес, впереди с кровавым флагом, и за вьюгой невидим, и от пули невредим, нежной поступью над вьюжной, снежной россыпью жемчужной, в белом венчике изрос, впереди Иисус Христос. And so they keep a martial pace. Behind them follows the hungry dog, ahead of them with bloody banner, unseen with blizzard swirl, safe from any bullet's harm, with gentle step above the storm, in the scattered pearl-like snow, crowned in a wreath of roses white. Ahead of them goes Jesus Christ. If you're wondering what Jesus is doing there, ask me after the talk. A much more certainly enigmatic text or poem by the equally great poet Osip Mandelstam from 1920. Mandelstam's essential project is to see the revolution as part of a series of historical upheavals that need to be in some ways mythopoetically sutured in terms of an understanding of the relationship between remembrance and oblivion. Understood often in terms of a kind of archaic Greek poetics of a descent into the underworld, in which the underworld is essentially imaged as a form of poetic unconscious. So here in these lines, в Петербурге мы сойдемся снова, словно солнце мы похоронили в нем, и блаженное бессмысленное слово в первый раз произнесем. We shall meet once more in Petersburg as though we had buried the sun, and for the first time utter the sacred, meaningless word. This блаженное бессмысленное слово, the sacred, meaningless word, is going to be understood in somewhat different ways by the futurists who are equally interested in the idea of the volatile signifier. We'll come back to this in a different context in a minute. And here we have Mayakovsky, who, I just realized it's not very well, part of it has been actually cut off. I wonder why. But it's more or less visible, yes. Here we have his Ode to the Revolution, written at the beginning of 1918. Тебе, обывательское, о, будь ты проклята трижды, а мое поэтово, о, четырежды славься благословенное. To you, the Philistine cry, may you be thrice cursed, but I, a poet, say, fourfold glory be to thee, O blessed one. Here, Mayakovsky is combining the poetics of the Pindaric Ode with Slavic liturgy, both of these ancient traditions being in some ways fundamentally transformed in a kind of fusion of blasphemy and sacralization in terms of here an odic praise to the Russian Revolution. So as you can see, the legacy of Russian poetic modernism, and here I might sit down again, would appear to point in one particular direction, which is largely that of what we might call millenarian eschatology. We've seen the Christian or the archaic Greek elements in all of the poems that I have briefly touched upon today, and it's precisely this kind of eschatological current that appears to be largely commandeered, if you like, or captured by the Russian poets of this particular generation and applied in some fashion to the revolutionary vision of cosmic renewal. But I want to suggest, in fact, that today I'm going to talk about a very different poet, Velimir Khlebnikov. His dates are given on the board, on the screen there, 1885 to 1922. And my essential point is going to be that in some fundamental way, Khlebnikov breaks with this eschatological, millenarian, quasi-Christian or transformedly Christian tradition in favor of what I would call a rationally constructed linguistic utopia. So one of the underlying threads of my talk is going to be the exploration of the extent to which rationalist utopia can break successfully with the eschatological tradition, with the millenarian religious tradition, or if in fact there are certain underlying continuities or coherences between the two, something that we might want to return to also in our discussion. Khlebnikov's culminating work was in fact something that he himself called a sverchpovest, which is in fact a neologism in Russian and is often translated by the English super saga, right? And it was this super saga was something that he called Zangezi. You can see the cover version of the text with an illustration by his friend Piotr Maturich. Zangezi is also a neologism, and in fact, the roots of this particular toponym, I suppose, as well as title, are taken from two rivers. One being the African river Zambezi, the second being the Indian river Ganges or Ganga, right? And this Afro-Indian fusion will give you a sense of the underlying geopoetics, if you like, the planetary vision that in fact undergirds this particular text, which points, as you can see, well beyond the familiar either Russian or Eurocentric concerns of the Russian literary tradition. What's interesting about Zangezi, I want to suggest, is that it adumbrates nothing less than a new vision of world history, world geography, as well as a universal language. As you can see, Khlebnikov is nothing if not ambitious. Like much of Khlebnikov's poetry, the work of a poet's poet, Zangezi failed to elicit widespread comprehension amongst the wider public. Yet its impact on select figures of the Soviet avant-garde and left intelligentsia was profound. Here we have behind me, which was also on the poster, I believe, the affiche, the poster announcing the production of this particular play. It was staged no less than 3 times in 1923 by the celebrated Soviet constructivist Vladimir Tatlin in the Petrograd Museum of Artistic Culture, which was itself a Tatlin-led institution and arguably the world's first museum dedicated exclusively to contemporary art, something that I think is not widely known amongst art historians. Zangezi, I want to suggest, stands alongside Tatlin's own proposed monument to the Third International of 1919-1920. Now, this is, of course, an iconic, though never built, emblem of Russian revolutionary utopianism. For those of you who are interested in art history or architectural history, I think the main contribution beyond my larger theorization of Khlebnikov and the problem of geopoetics and utopianism, my main sort of, let's say, scholarly contribution in this particular article, and this is going to be much clearer from the written version, is that no one has successfully juxtaposed Tatlin's monument alongside his production of Khlebnikov's Zangezi, to see how the two works, one obviously architectural, the other a piece of what we might call avant-garde performance, how they mutually inform each other in terms of a poetics of space. And so this is something I'll be coming back to in the second half of my talk. My argument will be then that both Zangezi and the monument that you see behind me are immensely ambitious attempts to generate an artistic form and a set of constructive principles equal to the global resonance of the Russian Revolution. Now, of course, the convergence of revolutionary politics and artistic literary avant-gardism has long been regarded as a striking feature of early Soviet culture. Yet the significance of this convergence has yet to be posed clearly by more recent theorizations of world literature. And here I want to make a brief gesture towards some of the debates that are occurring in comparative literature. This is much more extensively dealt with in the written version of the article. I had to cut it short, keeping in mind also the time involved and also the patience of the audience. This requires that we go back to the years prior to the bureaucratic constitution of Soviet literature with its familiar themes of socialist construction and the brotherhood of peoples, to a time when utopian visions of world revolution, fostered by the Comintern, coexisted with the extreme privations and deprivations of war communism. This is the period from 1918 to 1921, which unleashes an incredibly fervid period of not only poetic creation or creativity in Khlebnikov, but also the apotheosis or the apogee of his so-called theoretical or theorizations about time-space, which I will to some extent touch upon later in the piece, but it's such a bottomless pit that I will only gesture towards it in this particular article, or in this particular presentation. It was during these years of revolutionary hope, material destitution, and uncertain state patronage that Russia's avant-garde poets and artists further radicalized their ongoing turn toward formal abstraction. So one of the threads in my talk is going to be this tension between concreteness on the one hand, the concreteness of time and place, of geopoetics understood as a connection in some ways to the soil, to a regional or a provincial space, and on the other hand, this idea that a persistent feature of Russian avant-garde practice, both literary but above all painterly, which is the turn towards abstraction, which is a part of the story of modernism throughout Europe. By analytically decomposing the linguistic and artistic raw materials of the creative process and reconstituting them as a new means to signify the coordinates of space and of time, the Russian avant-garde strove to generate a planetary internationalism of aesthetic form commensurate with world revolution. This vision was grounded in the specificities of Eurasian history and geography, of which Russia was, of course, the most recent, albeit territorially the largest component. At the same time, the regional geopoetics of the Russian avant-garde point beyond the Eurasian landmass to the structuring principles of the modern artistic and social utopia. And here I want to say a few words about utopia, bringing some ideas that I've derived from the French historian and thinker Louis Marin, but also connecting up to certain ideas that have circulated through the Frankfurt School, specifically Ernst Bloch. So bear with me for just a moment and then I'll return to the text. Unrealized and essentially unrealizable, Russian avant-garde utopianism produced a cultural surplus or supplement that resonates to this day as an implicit corrective to policies pursued by the Bolsheviks during the heady initial years of the Comintern. This cultural surplus, most abundantly found in the writings of the futurist poet Velimir Khlebnikov, also highlights the limits of the modern social imaginary, founded as it is upon the twin forces of the nation-state and of the market, which inform recent theories of world literature. So my point essentially here is twofold. One is that most debates on Russian or Soviet utopianism or utopian thinking have focused primarily on the visual arts, on Malevich, as well as Malevich's suprematism, as well as the constructivists. And my argument, in fact, is that Khlebnikov's poetry and his broader body of work, in fact, offers, if anything, an even richer body of writing about which to think, yes? To think through the problem of utopianism. And my second point is, in fact, that Khlebnikov gives us a key to thinking about breaking with the two constitutive spatial models by which world literature has been thought, first being the territorial nation-state, and second being the deterritorializing force of the world market. And in fact, he has a lot more to say about this in his theoretical writings as well as by implication in his poetry. So the deep structure of Zangezi, I would argue, mirrors what Louis Marin has identified as the characteristic structural tension of the modern literary political utopia. And here I have a quote that you can see behind me. On the one hand, and this is a translation from the French, so it's a little bit more Baroque than it perhaps would otherwise be. On the one hand, the free play of the imagination and its indefinite expansion measured only by the desire, itself infinite, for happiness in a space where the moving frontiers of its political and philosophical and political fictions would be traced. On the other hand, the exactly close totality, rigorously coded by all the constraints and obligations of the law, binding and closing a place with insuperable frontiers that would guarantee its harmonious functioning. In other words, the point I'm trying to emphasize in this rather lengthy sentence is a contrast, if you like, a kind of binary opposition, if you like, between closure on the one hand and liberation on the other. In other words, a deterritorializing force that we could associate with emancipation, with freedom, and on the other hand, the idea that no utopia can function without clearly defined boundaries. And it's those boundaries that, in fact, govern and render efficacious the harmonious principles by which that utopia is governed. Marin's observation is perhaps nothing more than a spatial rendering of the constitutive contradiction between utopia as a state of being, the perfected place that is at the same time a no place, whose first modern articulation was Thomas More's Utopia of 1571, and utopia as an experience of becoming, an anticipatory impulse or desire which, far from merely offering the premature and illusory solution of social contradictions, represents what Ernst Bloch once called cultural surplus, the concentrated dream image of unfulfilled human potential whose realization is projected onto an alternative future. So the underlying contradiction I want to suggest between utopian thought, or within utopian thought, between totality and infinity, or between closure and liberty, it can be essentially boiled down to 2 points that I've shared with you on the screen. The powerful tension between the emancipatory potential of the Russian Revolution, whose aesthetic analog would be the Cubo-futurist and Russian formalist liberation of the signifier, locally dubbed the self-sufficient word, samavitaya slovo in Russian, from the constraints of conventional meaning and everyday use, and its at its totalizing or authoritarian impulse, which the poet-artist would claim by reviving the Prometheanism of the 19th century British Romantics, who, in the word of Shelley, had elevated the poet-artist to the ranks of an unacknowledged legislator of mankind. So what I'm suggesting, as you can see here, is that the Russian avant-garde essentially reproduces utopia's constitutive tension between closure and freedom by, on the one hand, embracing what I call the linguistic freedom of the self-sufficient word, the liberation of the signifier, if you will, but on the other hand, also the totalizing impulse, which is based on the authority of the poet prorok, the poet-prophet, a tradition that has roots in Russia going back to the early 19th century, specifically to the Russian Romantic poets. I gave you the example of Shelley for those of you who are unfamiliar with Pushkin. However, at the same time, I want to suggest that this particular opposition between closure and liberty is going to be crucially mediated. In other words, it's not simply a set of abstract oppositions, closure, infinity, or closure, liberty, emancipation versus totalization, but rather there is actually a kind of a mediating agent that is functioning to move these pieces around, if you will, in a particular work of art, and that is in fact going to be geopoetics. And here I move now to the problem of geopoetics as it is articulated on Russian soil and how it might be relevant to Khlebnikov's own work. Like its counterparts elsewhere in the world, the Russian avant-garde strove to overcome the so-called backwardness of local culture by adapting and radicalizing artistic innovations then emanating from Europe. At the same time, it shared with other avant-garde movements a competitive and agonistic understanding of global literary artistic practice that permitted, indeed necessitated, bold assertions of regionalism as well as nativist cultural pride. The constitutive tension between indigeneity, that is, autochthony or nativism, and internationalism was particularly apparent in the Russian avant-garde, whose regionalism was realized through an ongoing search for cultural continuities common to the Eurasian landmass as a whole, and whose internationalism was manifested through the establishment of epistemological or aesthetic principles deemed universal, yet irreducible to Western bourgeois culture. Those of you who are familiar with manifestos, for example, produced in Brazil or Latin America, or indeed in other parts of the global south, including, say, India, possibly China, will be interested to know, in fact, that some of these ideas are already circulating in Russia on the eve of World War I. And in many ways, I would suggest that the Russian avant-garde prepares the way for comparable manifestations of avant-garde regionalism that we normally associate with the decolonizing world. If the analogy is apt, it's because, in fact, of course, Russia, alongside the Ottoman Turkey and Ottoman and Habsburg Austria-Hungary, was in fact the first multi-ethnic empire to actually decolonize. So in many ways, I think the Russian example is an extremely important one to understand the dynamics of the 20th century that we normally associate with the period following World War II. Closer in spirit and in intent to the so-called peripheral modernisms of Latin America and India than to the Fauvist or Cubist experiments in Europe, of which they were acutely aware, Russia's avant-garde painters sought to rehabilitate the marginalized folk traditions of the Slavic peasantry and the decorative arts of the Eurasian landmass. This tendency, dubbed neo-primitivism in 1913, was arguably the most explicit act of self-orientalization that Russian culture had yet witnessed, one that encompassed as well as transcended Russia's boundaries. So I'm going to give you one very small example of this from Russian painting, which is a manifesto written by Natalia Goncharova, the painter Natalia Goncharova, and I'm going to suggest, in fact, that Khlebnikov offers a kind of literary poetic equivalent to the kind of work that was being pursued by Goncharova and others on the eve of World War I. In the quote that you see above, is it visible? Yeah. At the beginning of my development, I learned most of all from my French contemporaries. Now I shake the dust off my feet and leave the West. My path is toward the source of all the arts, the East. I aspire towards nationality and the East, not to narrow the problems of art, but on the contrary, to make it all-embracing and universal. Now, what's interesting about this particular quote is the kind of polyvalent function of this toponym East, Vostok in Russian, right? It is on the one hand a marker of ethnicity or nationality, as she points out. It appears to be a geographical marker, right? On the other hand, it is also the source of an alternative universality. And this is the crucial point, right? Normally we think about universalism being the projection of modern European bourgeois culture. What is interesting about the Russian neo-primitivists and Khlebnikov after him is that they're thinking essentially about the possibility of a non-Western, non-bourgeois universalism or universality that would be based on a different set of aesthetic, poetic, and ultimately political principles. How successful they are, and to what extent a statement like this is merely reactive, right, is another question that we can also explore in the Q&A. What my point essentially at this point is that this eastward turn that you see adumbrated in the quote of Russian painting finds a kind of unexpected verbal correlative in the Russian futurist proclamation of the radical autonomy of the verbal sign. Right? So this is the point that I want to make, which is not immediately obvious, right? That this idea of an alternative geography oriented or tilted towards Asia, right, is in some fashion going to be connected in the work of Khlebnikov to the idea of the radicalization of language itself, right, and specifically of the signifier, in order to produce a kind of new language, a new universal language, a kind of Khlebnikovian Esperanto, which I'm going to give you some wonderful examples of a little later in the talk. Yes, I think I've more or less already adumbrated this, right? So, never fully realized and self-consciously utopian, the legacy of the Russian avant-garde reveals an alternative geopoetics of world literature that would no longer be exclusively defined by the cultural assumptions and the political ascendancy of the West. This geopoetic mediation, in which the Eurasian region came to be seen as a catalyst for a new global imaginary, was most ambitiously and vividly achieved by the Russian futurist poet Khlebnikov. Khlebnikov's earliest reflections on the patterns of Eurasian history were rooted in Slavic philology and motivated by the neo-primitivism of the Russian avant-garde, just as his long-standing quest to ascertain the laws of time arose well before the watershed of October 1917, which the poet in fact claimed to have foreseen. At the same time, Khlebnikov's post-revolutionary writings show a marked tendency to approximate the lively debates on national and social liberation then being conducted by Bolshevik leaders and their interlocutors in the Comintern. A crucial event in this regard, arguably spurring Khlebnikov's own explorations of space-time, was the Congress of the Peoples of the East, held in September 1920 under Comintern auspices in recently Sovietized Baku, where it was proclaimed that, I quote, all communists, Russian, French, British, Italian, and so on, have now become Asian and are resolved to help every revolutionary movement in the East and in Africa. It's interesting to know that it has not been definitively established that Khlebnikov was in Baku at the time of the conference, but he was in Baku immediately after the conference and possibly before. The biography of Khlebnikov is very difficult to resurrect given the fact that he spent most of these years, these revolutionary years of war communism, wandering around dressed in rags, with a pillowcase which was the main archive and repository of his manuscripts. People would find him basically filthy and bedraggled on the roads of Azerbaijan and the Caucasus, and women were often moved to feed him and give him a bath. So as you can see, archival and textual problems for a poet such as this proved to be particularly difficult. So I want to now move towards the text Zangezi, which is written in precisely this time, composed in fact between 1920 and 1922, while Khlebnikov is essentially negotiating the upheavals of the Russian Civil War in places as far-flung as Gilan in northern Iran, all over Azerbaijan, the Caucasus, as well as Ukraine. Zangezi, which was completed in 1922, is arguably the supreme creative expression of Khlebnikov's search to renew poetic form in the wake of his claim to have discovered the underlying regularities of space-time. If you read his letters that he's writing desperately to various figures, including none other than the great Russian playwright, theater director Meyerhold, he says, I've been sitting in Baku, and I'm now proud to say that I've discovered the underlying laws of time. Right? So you'll be pleased to know that this occurred in none other than Baku in Azerbaijan. An amalgam of prophetic utterance, densely alliterative verse, exuberantly neologistic wordplay, and quasi-scientific, I dare not say pseudo-scientific data, purporting to elucidate the phonic, spatial, and rhythmic temporal laws of Eurasian and world history. Zangezi is, in essence, an avant-garde Gesamtkunstwerk, and I'm quite advisedly using the Nietzschean term, or rather the Wagnerian term, and I'll come back to Nietzsche in just a minute. It is a text that seeks to do nothing less than reconcile the architectonics of cubism and constructivism, the dynamism of theatrical performance, as well as the disintegration of epic narrative into lyric fragments, the latter being the consistent response of Russia's poets since at least Pushkin to the receding viability of epic form. The opening lines of Zangezi herald the text as a radical generic innovation. Now, you might recall, as I mentioned, that Khlebnikov, in fact, created a neologism to describe the new genre that he had created. He called it a super saga. And as we can see, or as you can see on the screen, he defines the super saga as follows. A super saga, and for those of you who are interested in the problem of how a text is put together, what's quite handy here is that Khlebnikov essentially gives us a set of stage prompts, if you will, right? As well as a kind of a metapoetic description of how the text should be understood. So a super saga is put together from independent fragments, each with its own special god, special faith and statute. Each has been granted the freedom to profess its own faith. The constructive unit or building block of the super saga is the first order narrative. It resembles a statue made of different blocks of stone of varying color, its body consisting of white stone, its cloak and attire of blue, its eyes of black. It is carved out of the multicolored blocks of the word, each with its own structure. Thus do we find a new kind of operation in the realm of verbal affairs. A story, raskas, is architecture with words. Architecture with stories is a super saga. Right? The artist's building block is no longer the word, but the first order narrative. So Khlebnikov is trying to think about, on the one hand, the creation or generation of a new genre, a new literary theatrical genre, but he's also thinking about, in a sense, the constructive principles, right? The compositional principles of this particular text, and how he's trying to reimagine it, moving away from the word in the narrow sense towards a higher level of unity. So here what I'm going to do is basically, in the time remaining, do two things. On the one hand, talk about the text as a theatrical performance, in other words, as a visual and performative phenomenon, as it was produced by Tatlin, and talk a little bit about the way in which this particular text might allow us to throw additional light on the problem, not just of Tatlin's tower, his famous Monument to the Third International, but also more generally the problem of revolutionary utopianism in the Russian, so early Soviet context. And then I'm going to give you a couple of examples of the text as a poetic or linguistic literary phenomenon. In other words, not so much as a visual phenomenon or a performative theatrical one, but as a literary one. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of the truly extraordinary work that Khlebnikov does with language. And you'll be pleased to know, in fact, that Khlebnikov has been translated quite extensively into English by an extraordinary gentleman by the name of Paul Schmidt. He was a professor at UT Austin, but in fact lived for many, many years in Manhattan, in Lower Manhattan, not far from NYU, up the road. In fact, he was involved with a very famous, well-known off-Broadway theater group called the Worcester Group. Some of you may have heard of it. It's an important, featured importantly in the theatrical history of Manhattan in the late, I guess now already the late 20th century. He was a remarkable man, and when I lived in Manhattan in the 90s, I remember hanging out with him. And so the text is available and is very enormously fun to read, although of course completely baffling at various points. But remember that high seriousness and goofiness are very closely related in Khlebnikov. So when you laugh, you're probably meant to. Right? All right, we'll get to that in a minute. So Khlebnikov's account of the compositional principles of Zangezi closely parallels debates in the visual arts during the dramatic transition from pre-war Cubo-futurism to Soviet constructivism. The division of the text into 21, no less than 21 distinct verbal planes, ploskosti, composed separately between 1920 and 22, recalls Cubism's fracturing of linear perspective into elementary geometrical forms and simultaneous angles of vision. Just imagine any painting by Picasso, by Braque, for example, right? A method that Zangezi explicitly acknowledges as the basis of language as well. Take a look at this particular phrase, which can only be understood, in my opinion, in the context of a more broadly European modernist or avant-garde painting, both, not just Cubism, but I want to suggest futurism, Italian futurism. Words do not exist. There are only movements in space and its parts, planes, the lines defining an area, the impact of points, the divine circle, the angle of incidence, the fascicule of rays, proceeding from point or penetrating it. These are secret building blocks of language, right? So it's interesting here that Khlebnikov is in some ways decomposing language into energetic principles, right? And we're going to see how they then ramify into a kind of poetics of space as well as of time in just a minute. But here, the emphasis that you see here on movement, on a particular idea of space as a kind of kinetic field of forces, clearly recalls Italian futurism's critique of the static nature of French, or of the École de Paris, of French Cubism, and its inability to move beyond three-dimensionality. While Vladimir Tatlin explicitly pointed to Khlebnikov's feeling for the sculptural plasticity of sound as in some ways fundamentally analogous to constructivist design, with its commitment to the tectonics or the texture of constructed objects. So here you can see none other than Vladimir Tatlin, looming large. He was in fact not just the director, but also the hero of the production. And in fact, one of the things I really want to emphasize to those of you who are art historians is that Khlebnikov is really Tatlin's secret hero, right? And he, in my opinion, if Tatlin did not succumb to the pressures of Stalinism and of socialist realism, to the extent that many of his comrades in the constructivist movement or tendency did, including Rodchenko and others, it's largely because he remained faithful to this older utopian vision of Khlebnikov. So as you can see from this slide, and I'm going to show you a couple in just a minute, the insistence on technical rigor, on the transparent and rational organization of space, the surface tactility of materials deployed, all find resonance in Tatlin's production of Zangezi. What is particularly evident, of course, is the geometricization of space, which is at once a search for theatrical equivalence to Khlebnikov's theory of language, but also an extension of Tatlin's own guiding principles. Above all, the organizing role of an upwardly thrusting line, often diagonal or sloping, and here I'm getting to my juxtaposition of this particular production alongside the Monument to the Third International, right? An upwardly sloping or diagonal line, which marks many of his earlier pre-revolutionary counter-reliefs, as well as his celebrated Monument to the Third International. So here you can see, and I'm going to come back to this, this is one of the largest sketches we have of Tatlin's production of Zangezi from 1923. And here you can see, I'll come back to this in just a minute, the figure of Zangezi, who is the hero prophet, looming large at the very top of the sketch, and linked by a series of obviously abstract planes and lines, but a kind of diagonal that is essentially bisecting the sketch into two triangular spaces, with the masses, the vox populi, if you will, gathered below, pointing towards him. The formal homologies between Tatlin's monument and his staging of Zangezi merit much closer attention. In fact, they have not been the subject of much serious scholarly attention. In both the play and the monument, a vertical axis. Oh, what happened? Okay. I'll just keep talking. In both the play and the monument, a vertical axis perpendicular to the earth serves to structure the political organization and discursive power. So, for example, if you take a look at this particular slide, or actually the next one is even clearer, you see here, for example, a glass cube, a pyramid, and above that a cylinder, and each of them were meant to rotate independently at different velocities, representing the span of a year, a month, and a day. And this was Tatlin's attempt essentially to link, if you like, the movement, the cosmic movement of the spheres, if you will, to the specific political, the distribution of political power and political agency amongst the deliberative, the executive, and the and the propagandistic informational arms of the Communist International, right? So you have the legislature here, you have the executive power, the equivalent of the White House, if you will, here in the middle, and then interestingly, the propagandistic and informational element is perched at the very top, above the executive and the legislative arms of the Comintern. And we might want to think more about why the propagandistic informational organ of the Comintern, oh, the light's back, should occupy such a prominent role. So I want to suggest that there is some kind of interesting analogy if we take a look at the sketch of Zangezi alongside the representation of the monument. We can see, in fact, that there's a certain kind of interesting spatial formal analogy between the two, well, the text, if you will, or the staging of the text and the monument itself. In the play, just like the monument, arranges its various discursive planes in a hierarchical order, ascending vertically and culminating in the figure of Zangezi himself. To be sure, Tatlin's monument dissolves the neo-romantic aura of the Khlebnikovian prophet, right, into a rigorously functional information office, right, which, as you can see, of course, is not necessarily manned, right, situated at the tower's apex and dedicated, in the words of the art historian Nikolai Punin, to the publication of proclamations, brochures, and manifestos. In a word, all the various means of broadly informing the international proletariat, and in particular a telegraph and a radio station, the masts of which arise above the monument. So what I want to suggest is that essentially Tatlin's monument in some ways abolishes the figure that we're going to be now exploring of the poet-prophet, right, that you see perched at the very top of the staged production of the play, and displaces it onto modern technology, right? The broadcasting tower, if you will, right? But we might want to think about the way in which the poet-prophet, which is obviously an archaic neo-romantic figure, corresponds to this, the functionalism, if you like, of the tower, and how we might want to think the two, the functionalism of the 20th century utopian monument alongside the neo-romantic aura that lingers in Tatlin's production, which is, of course, an inheritance from Khlebnikov, who in turn takes it from the 19th century romantics. What's interesting is that Nikolai Punin, who was an extraordinarily astute art historian and one of the most well-informed left intellectuals living in Leningrad, or Petrograd at this particular time, didn't notice, in fact, the role of Tatlin's diagonal, which you can see, I think, relatively clearly here, both here as well as the sloping nature of the tower. Specifically, the way in which the diagonal in some fashion reconciles and supports the monument's other upward lines, specifically the vertical axis constituted by the four rotating glass stories of the monument, as well as the iron spirals that gird it from without. In Tatlin's monument, a diagonally tilted line mediates between the politically functioning vertical principle and the largely symbolic double helix, itself leaning at the Earth's axial tilt, which Punin viewed as the ideal expression of emancipation from all animal, earthbound, and reptilian interests, right? The material expression of a materialist transcendence of matter. Tatlin's Zangezi, which lacks a corresponding spiral framework, once again inserts a diagonal axis, which appears to offer a dialectical mediation between the authoritarian principle of vertical hierarchy, right, culminating in Zangezi's eyrie, and the horizontal space of the vox populi below. This diagonal axis, I want to hypothesize, may well have theatrically arranged the Supersaga's heterogeneous linguistic planes, which I argue correspond essentially to Khlebnikov's Eurasian Geopoetics. Now, in the time remaining, I know I don't have too much time, so I'm trying to think about how I can best use the, say, 10-15 minutes I have left to talk about the transition, if you will, from the linguistic, or rather from the visual to the linguistic. And perhaps the best way to think about this is by looking at a passage here from the very beginning of the text, and then giving you a couple of examples of Khlebnikov's experiments with sound. And we're going to listen to both to the twittering of some birds, right? It's nice to restore Twitter to its original avian value. And then we're going to look at some neologistic and extravagantly playful poetry, which we have wonderful renderings of in English thanks to Paul Schmidt, whom I mentioned earlier. So, in the text that I've just read you, we read the following words: the mountains. And what's interesting, of course, is here Khlebnikov is actually giving us a vision of geopoetics in a relatively natural setting, right? And what's interesting is how this natural space, we still have trees here, we have mountains here, is entirely abstracted by Tatlin's constructivist stage setting, right? So we might want to think about the way in which nature, or the natural and the abstract function in this particular play, and the movement between the two, which I think is not simply Tatlin betraying Khlebnikov's vision. I think it's already implicit in Khlebnikov. The betrayal of nature, right, or the disappearance of nature is already inscribed into Khlebnikov's utopia. But let's take a look at this particular quote. The mountains. Above a clearing, there rises a steep and shaggy crag that resembles an iron needle seen through a magnifying glass. Like a pilgrim's staff leaning against a wall, it stands beside the steep slopes of layers of rock overgrown by a forest of pines. A bridge-like platform connects it to the bedrock, the result of an avalanche that fell on the cliff top like a straw hat. This platform is Zangezi's favorite place. He comes here every morning and recites its songs. Now, as you can see even from this particular quote, those of you who have read your Nietzsche will of course recognize that this particular moment, and in fact much of the play afterwards, is very closely modeled on Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, right? Which is in fact the text's most pervasive intertext, if you will, right? Alongside a long succession of biblical and various Oriental prophets. Now, if one, in a sense, compares Nietzsche's Zarathustra to Khlebnikov's Zangezi, we see a great deal of things in common, specifically the series of encounters between the prophet seated in his mountain eyrie and the people below, right? But perhaps more interestingly than simply noticing the obvious spatial and discursive analogy between Nietzsche and Khlebnikov is to notice also what is different. And what is actually different is really what makes Khlebnikov's Zangezi a radically modernist text, rather than simply a neo-romantic one. And that is in fact the sense of the text as being radically fragmented, radically heterogeneous, even on the level of discourse, in that it incorporates a level of what Bakhtin would have called dialogism, that is to say, multiple, not just sociolects, but also scientific discourses, bird song, the ululations of pagan deities. All of this gets packed into the text to create a sense of polyphony that is all unprecedented even by the standards of a tradition that gave rise to someone like Mikhail Bakhtin. So in the time that I have remaining, what I really want to do is just share a few examples of the different kinds of verbal discourses that Khlebnikov gives rise to, and which he relegates to specific planes that are organized according to this sort of diagonal axis, linking Khlebnikov on the very top to the people gathered at the very bottom. So one example the first example that I thought I might share with you is in fact birdsong. This is in fact the opening section of the play itself, and it's on plane 1, and it's an enchanting morning chorus of birds. So we begin plunged in nature, right? And these birds are described in extraordinary detail in terms of their specific species name, the particular trees or plants and forests where they're found, and also, crucially importantly, by virtue of onomatopoeia, right, we have their actual avian sounds, their bird call. So let's take a look. Swallow. Sivit, sivit. Black-banded warbler. Bebot, eugenias. Cuckoo, cuckoo, cuckoo. Rocks back and forth on a treetop. But then, as the text now moves to an end, silence, a young bird catcher passes with a cage in hand. So what's going on here? How can we think about this? Again, I'm trying to concentrate my conclusions in a relatively small space of time. What's happening here? We have on the one hand Khlebnikov's desire, if you like, to create a kind of encyclopedia of sound, right? And sound understood as embracing the full phonic possibility of not just human existence, but indeed existence as a whole, right? But before we embrace Khlebnikov as a figure who, in a sense, is trying to bring the birds and the beasts into discourse, we should also notice, of course, the figure of the bird catcher, right? This particular plane ends with the birds being tamed, right? Tamed and mastered essentially by humanity. Something very similar will happen on plane 10, which is in fact described as the flight of the gods. And these gods, interestingly, are gathered from places as far afield as Zululand, ancient Egypt, as well as different parts of Asia and Latin America. And in this particular, and I'm going to give you only the English here because we don't have time, we have the following. But before we, even to understand this and to read it properly, a little nugget of Khlebnikovian science, linguistic science. Khlebnikov believed that, in fact, the first letter or sound of each word determined its semantic import. In other words, alliteration had specific objective values, right? These were not simply forms of poetic fantasy or poetic play. They had specific rigorous spatial values, right? That he actually tried to scientifically establish. So what we're going to find here, in fact, is that M, which is the first letter of the Russian moch or magu, I can, right? Has invaded the lands of B. B being the first letter of the Russian Bukh, meaning God, right? So what this particular section of the play does essentially is to show us the dispersal of the world of the divine by a new principle, which is the linguistic rationality, the linguistic utopia, that is also about the enablement of human effort, right? Magu, I can, right? To overcome the fetters of the divine. So it's a kind of prophecy that is actually ushering in a kind of post-religious utopia. Magus of magnitudes, master of muchness, Mughal eyes, mogmouth, muchness of muchnesses. M is the dispersion of volume into infinitely smaller parts. Now M has invaded the lands of B. Now is the coming of M, mallet that mauls the great, 1,000 mouses, magu, magu. Zangezi, listen, can you hear the proud flourish? Magu. Can you hear the gods beating their wings, startled by our shouting? The crowd, the gods are flying away, the gods are flying away. So, what is interesting then, as you can see, is that Zangezi embraces, through this proliferation of different planes, the possibility of multiple discursive possibilities, the realm of birds and animals, who are largely confined to places of concretion, that is to say, of natural habitat. Right? Then you have the gods, who themselves will become superseded, until we finally get the proclamation of Zangezi's laws of time and of space. But instead of moving to that, because I'm aware of the constraints of time, I'm basically going to break down the play in about 5 minutes that I have left into 3 dominant functions, and then give you a riotously interesting example of the final function. And here I'm going to be using, for those of you who are familiar with the Russian critical tradition, the model proposed by Roman Jakobson in his famous article on linguistics and poetics, with a nod also to Gilles Deleuze's Mille Plateaux. My argument essentially is that Zangezi has 3 discursive modes that operate and coexist in order to construct its particular poetic universe. On the one hand, we have a kind of scientific interpretive mode, which is essentially metalingual in function. In other words, it's focused primarily on explaining the abstract principles by which language itself functions and the different linguistic or other codes actually function. So, for example, this is the astral language of consonants, right? That I've given you one example of, in which M has a particular function of dispersing the letter B. And Khlebnikov is going to insist on the absolute scientificity and universality of these particular consonantal principles that he's going to see as essentially potentially universalizable and functioning as a kind of what I would call a revolutionary Esperanto that is going to be embraced by the masses of the world. So this is the first example of Khlebnikovian discursive mode, and it's largely given the form of glossaries, which the prophet Zangezi will essentially explain to the ignorant masses. The second, perhaps more interesting level of Khlebnikov's Zangezi is what I call the prophetic revelatory mode. Right? And I'm not wanting to dismiss the persistence of a kind of neo-romantic prophetic revelatory mode in Khlebnikov. I don't believe that he's modernist in a kind of radically dispersive sense. And that remains very much something that Khlebnikov was deeply invested in to the very end of his life, a kind of neo-romantic persona. And this corresponds, interestingly, to two different levels. One is the referential level, which is about the relationship between the code, if you will, and the message, or rather the referential message to which it refers, which in fact turns out to be nothing less than all of human history and all of human geography, right? All embraced and calculated according to the laws of time and space that I can share with you if you're dying to know during Q&A, right? What is equally interesting, in fact, is that this prophetic revelatory mode is also tied to what Jacobson called the phatic function, which all of us are familiar with whenever we answer our cell phones and say hello. In other words, it's about the function that focuses on the relationship between the addressee and the addressor. Do you hear me? Right? And one of the interesting things about Zangezi is its profound anxiety about whether the prophet is heeded. Right? It's an old topos, right? Going back to the Bible, right? The voice crying in the wilderness, and it's one that Khlebnikov is acutely aware of and takes up in his own work. The final, in my opinion, the most interesting mode in Zangezi is what I call the poetic imaginative mode, which is, in my opinion, the mode that functions in excess of even the scientific utopian principles that Khlebnikov establishes. And this is what the final idea that I wanted to leave with you, which is the sense that Khlebnikov's Zangezi produces certain forms of excess, of imaginative excess, that in fact escape even the kind of utopian confines of his own vision. Let's take one example, which I'm particularly fond of, and we have a wonderful translation by none other than Paul Schmidt. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Russian or with even experimental poetry in general, think back to something that I'm sure all of you have read, which is Lewis Carroll. Right? I'm sure many of you remember having read Jabberwocky when you were children, or perhaps even more recently. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe, old middensy were the borogoves, and the mome raths are grabe, etc., etc. This is, if you like, the Russian version of it. But interestingly, while Carroll's vision was circulating largely as a kind of children's fantasy, here Khlebnikov wants to somehow link the exuberance of linguistic play and of poetic fantasy to a particular social utopian vision. Let's take a look. Летуры летят в собеса, толпою ночей исчезают, потоком крылатые тоты, потопом небесной нетоты. Which Paul Schmidt has rendered as follows: Ledgelings in flight, seeking their self-land, flocking through darkness to vanishment, a swelling of heavenly neverings, a swirling of wing-welling overings. So, what am I going to say about all of this in conclusion? Let me jump over a little bit of my prepared talk and just move to the last page. So what I want to essentially suggest is that Zangezi is a radically diverse text, heterogeneous by virtue of its very structure. To be sure, the Super Saga strives consistently to subordinate the burgeoning diversity of its discursive registers to the extraordinary pronouncements of its main hero. As a diachronic elaboration of the hero's encounter with the people, Zangezi grounds its authority upon the figure of the poet-prophet, at once historical and linguistic. And here we have the poet-prophet looming large at the top of the photograph, right? Making him the emissary of a revolutionary utopia, at once historical and linguistic, which renders all discourses obsolete. In this sense, the text invites us to identify its universality as one with the figure of Zangezi himself. the harbinger of a new secular world in which time and space have been definitively codified and linguistic diversity reduced to one rational means of planetary communication. By abolishing all particularisms of faith and nationality, Zangezi may well be the Russian avant-garde's most ambitious attempt at fulfilling the totalizing impulses of all literary social utopias. At the same time, as a super saga composed of independent fragments, samostoятельные отрывки in Russian, Zangezi preserves the very differences that it seeks to supersede. From birdsong to the guttural ululations of pagan deities, the text explores the full gamut of semiotic and sonic possibility. Zangezi straddles the archaic charisma of the prophet and the authority of modern scientific method, moving between the animal and the mundanely human, the divine and the superhuman. It also repeatedly shifts generic registers, from lyric monologue to prose dialogue, from scientific exposition to tragicomic mystery play. I didn't even get to that stuff in this presentation. This alone frustrates any sense of incremental or teleological movement. The play ends in a comedic spirit, and I want to use the word comedy in the strong sense of Northrop Frye, who talks about the archetypal understanding of the tragic and the comic, whose deepest promise is renewal or resurrection, but at the cost of diminishing the aura of Zangezi as a prophet. The text's denouement is open-ended, the inverse of utopian closure. The homogenizing intent of Zangezi's prophetic revelations is held in check by the text's formal heterogeneity. So to conclude, how then might we read Zangezi's Khlebnikovs Zangezi as a text of world literature? The text's immediate context were the first post-revolutionary years during which the carnage and the privations of war communism existed with hopes of world revolution. While having little or nothing doctrinally in common with Marxist thought, Zangezi articulates an internationalism of poetic and cognitive innovation designed to unify the human race in tandem with the goal of world revolution. In Zangezi, the utopian promise of planetary unity coexists with the reality of a radically uneven world in which the archaic and the primitive, past, present, and future are seen to be coeval with the modern. It is precisely this unevenness to which Lenin, in Imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism, pointed as a singular feature of the contemporary world system, and which Trotsky would later generalize as the law of uneven and combined and uneven development. Khlebnikov's speculations on space-time, like his linguistic experiments, read overtly as a search for patterns underlying and correlating all phenomena. Yet even as they sought to resolve the unevenness of space-time into deeper regularities, Khlebnikov's theories led in practice to a montage-based poetics of radical juxtaposition. Events remote in time could be yoked together, generating a Eurasian and ultimately global alternative history in which the ancient, the contemporary, and the merely possible were in intimate dialogue. So in a manner characteristic of the Russian avant-garde, Velimir Khlebnikov straddled both the emancipatory and the totalizing impulses of the Russian Revolution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Harsha. So we do have time for some questions. I'm sure many of you have some questions. I think maybe since I don't know all of you, it might make sense for you to call on people, Harsha, and maybe you could identify yourself with your question. That would be great.
Rasim, go ahead.
Well, Harsha, thank you for making us partake in Khlebnikov's
madness
and, immeasurable ambition.
Yes. Uh-huh.
My question has to do with what you call his Eurasian Geopoetics, and because there no in the fragments of the text you presented, there were no concrete geographical reference. And I was wondering whether in the play itself, and unfortunately I haven't read it, how is geography figured,
No, it's a great question. Part of it is just because I boiled it down to one or two moments, right? I decided I would focus on the Tatlin production rather than the ways in which the play is actually Eurasian or Asiatic. So the ways in which it's Asiatic are two or threefold. Firstly, Khlebnikov is deeply interested in the arguments that are taking place in the Comintern around colonialism and imperialism. He writes a series of manifestos announcing the decolonization of Asia, Africa, in which Russia is playing a leading role. He declares that India, for example, is independent of Great Britain, etc., right? Much to, I'm sure, the surprise of many Indians in 1917. And so there's a political context in which this is happening, but in fact, Khlebnikov's Eurasian geopoetics are older and deeper than the Russian Revolution. They go back to the fact that he was born, I mean, in terms of on a level of just biography, he is born in the Kalmyk steppe, right? And in fact, throughout his youth, he was interested in, on the one hand, the natural history of Eurasia. His father is an ornithologist and a naturalist, so he has a deep interest in terrain, and the actual animal species that inhabit the natural world of Eurasia. He's trying to think, like many Russians of this particular period, alternative models of space and time to think Eurasian history that are irreducible to the grand narrative, if you like, of Europe, right? The grand sweep of the convergence of ancient Rome with Judeo-Christian civilization culminating in modernity, right? That's the familiar story of the world that we know, and his acute understanding, which is one that all Russians share, is that Russia doesn't fit into this story, or fits only marginally and tangentially and episodically, at least until the 18th century. So he's very much part of that story, but he's thinking about it in new ways, because he's not a Slavophile, and he's not a Russian nationalist. And that's what makes Khlebnikov different from many of the other thinkers of this time, right? So he's interested in alternative ways of thinking Slavic or Russian continuity with all of the other peoples and even species that inhabit Eurasian soil. So he writes, for example, letters. He has an extraordinary letter to 2 Japanese students that he writes, for example, I forget now exactly which year, but an extraordinary idea given the recent history of the Russo-Japanese War, in which he claims that in fact, and this is an interesting parallel with Ezra Pound and Ernest Fenollosa's almost parallel fascination with the Chinese alphabet, right? He's increasingly interested in the possibility that the Chinese alphabet, insofar as it is not based on phonetic specificity, right, can function as a kind of universal written script. And so Khlebnikov's own linguistic utopia, on some level, is an attempt at generating a set of universal phonemes that are destined to become graphemes, that are going to essentially make universal communication possible. And he actually compares the multiplicity of languages to capitalism. And he says, in fact, that this is a very different understanding of diversity, in fact, right? He says that, in fact, just as the market produces war, and he's, of course, thinking about World War I, so too the diversity of languages potentially produces conflict between peoples. And so the idea is, on the one hand, to become rooted, and this is my final point, I think, Rosen, there's a tension between concreteness and abstraction in Khlebnikov. So on the one hand, there's a deep fascination with every single bird or sheep that he might find on the steppe, right? Every single language that he might encounter as he's traveling like a vagabond through the Caucasus. On the other hand, he's trying to find a set of universal principles that would overcome those distinctions and that diversity, but in the name of a new set of universals that would somehow be distinct from the model of science that has emerged from bourgeois Europe. So there's definitely much more I could do and show that's connected more specifically to Eurasia and Eurasianness. But that's a short answer to your question. Yes?
Actually, I have a couple of comments, but maybe I'll just ask a question. Do you know, and thank you for the lovely talk. The question is, do you know what Khlebnikov's relationship is to earlier Western models of a perfect language? From Leibniz with his interest in China to the guy, I was trying to remember his name, the French guy that Benjamin Whorf was reading, the 19th century guy who developed a way of interpreting the Hebrew Bible that is remarkably Khlebnikovian.
Really? Okay.
I mean, if do you know anything?
So the thing is, I've looked for this, and in fact, I'm surprised that there's been not more work on this done. That's partly because most Khlebnikov studies are painfully philological, but you would think that this would be a philological question that they would answer, but so much of the work is still on a basic textological level, figuring out what these texts actually even mean half the time, that larger questions are often lost in the process. I have not seen anything about, related to Leibniz or 19th century artificial languages. The two languages that were certainly widely known to Russian intellectuals, artificial languages, would have been Esperanto and another one called Volapük, which was also circulating at this particular time. But more than that, I couldn't tell you. Clearly, what Khlebnikov is trying to do is bring to bear his pseudo-scientific research, right, with a sort of intuitive sense of Slavic languages, and specifically. One of the things that makes Khlebnikov rather limited, and almost comically limited, is that he actually doesn't know foreign languages. So he makes long lists of Slavic words, and they're all Slavic, really, with a small number of exceptions from Sanskrit that he just sort of randomly picked up from places. But he creates long lists of Slavic words, not just Russian, but also Ukrainian, South Slavic words, and then he tries to extract a semantic geometrical value from the initial letter or sound. And so there's a kind of a pseudo-positivist basis for this, but it's coming out of his own ideas. I'm not sure, I mean, certainly one could, Rimbaud and certain other poet modii of the late 19th century are also thinking about the relationship between, say, consonants and colors. So there are a certain number of analogies that one finds in late 19th century thought. The difference, I think, is that for Khlebnikov, this is a rationalist project. It's not a form of poetic imagination. Right? Yes. Oh, you had another question, but you'll come back to it. Okay. Thank you.
Jane Burbank.
Nice to meet you.
So this production is going on about the same time as the emergence of the first Eurasianists in the emigration.
Sofia, right.
And so Trubetskoy's Европа Человечества was 1921. So my question is, first, did he have contact with these people, and did he use the term Eurasian?
Thank you. Both excellent questions. The simple answer to your last question is no. And he's not formally in any way a part of the Eurasianist movement. The bridge figure between what is happening in immigration and Khlebnikov himself is none other than Roman Jakobson, who was a close friend of Khlebnikov, in fact, launches Khlebnikovs Studies as a scholarly field. And when he migrates to Prague, he's of course increasingly involved with the Eurasians in emigration.
Yeah.
Trubetskoy has an article in which he talks about the literary, I think this is actually in the preface to his Chod k Vostoku, if I'm not mistaken, where he talks about the fact that preceding the scholarly efforts of Trubetskoy and Savitsky and others were the work of poets, such as Blok, the Scythians, and I think he mentions Khlebnikov there. But I don't see any immediate correlation on the level of actual dialogue. But I do have an article on Jakobson and Khlebnikov in the light of Eurasianism. But my argument is not going to be that Khlebnikov was in direct dialogue.
Yeah.
And in fact, in many ways, he's more interesting than they are. Yes?
My name is Alexander Boshkovich. I really enjoyed the talk. Thank you for a lovely talk. I have a question, and I'll explain what this question is about. The question is, do you consider in any terms the concept of deferral somehow connected to the Khlebnikovs?
In the Derridian sense?
Yeah. And this is why. There's a Croatian avant-gardist, Alexander Flaka. He talked about this utopian projection into the future that has modernist form of a spiral. And the spiral is kind of beautiful representation of it. And then media theorists usually, Flusser, for example, talk about what's happening in modernity is this mythical time of the image, which is kind of circular, and historic time of the language, which kind of is progressive into the history. And spiral is
a reconciliation of
these two impulses. And from that point of view, does deferral as a concept has any meaning in Khlebnikovs, or at least your reading of it?
So how exactly would deferral connect specifically to the relationship between linear time and the static nature, and the circular nature?
It's kind of deferral of the progress
I
within the
see.
image of the spiral, for example.
I see.
And I mean, it is connected also with this aesthetic of montage. When you look at the photo montage, for example, what is the vintage point from which you encompass all these different perspectives, right? Because they are simultaneous. I mean, I don't know whether that's...
You're giving me something to think about. I had seen in some ways, I mean, I was trying to figure out how to think about both closure and radical openness. So it's possible that deferral might be a way to work through that problem. I was trying to think about it through the problem of the diagonal. Actually, I think we see it here. Actually, no, not so much here. But I'm particularly interested in the idea of how to think about historical time and spatial models. What's interesting about Khlebnikov is that he doesn't really have a clear sense of linear time or progress. He has an idea of the mathematization of time, but in fact what that produces is the possibility of juxtaposing entirely distinct moments in history along an axis of mathematical abstraction. So he has certain formulae that he comes up with that dictate the rise and fall of empires, for example. Right? The question is how that becomes visually available. And I think this is the only text really that I've seen that actually has a kind of visual or plastic theatrical life, right? So this is a question that doesn't really arise in the same way with Khlebnikov's poetry. So I need to think more about it. Thank you. Yes?
Thank you for a really expansive talk. One of the most thrilling moves of the talk that I felt was it's the fact that it moves past kind of concepts and dichotomies. You started with going past the market and nation as main terms of work, literature. But then what even blew my mind even more was bringing together this concept of Gesamtkunstwerk and the dialogic, which I usually think of as being completely, in opposition. And I saw there were terms that made me think of Bakhtin even before, so I totally see what you mean, and I totally also see kind of the universal pool of the Gesamtkunstwerk. And in your conclusion, you kind of beautifully brought this together in terms of the emancipatory and the totalizing impulses of the...
Oh, you've understood my talk well, thank you.
of the revolution. But part of me wanted more on that relationship. In the Q&A, you said the totalizing, the universalizing overcomes the particular. So, can you elaborate a little bit?
I have to say, in all honesty, I've written this, I've come to this particular point. When I write the book, I want to think a lot more about the text. I feel like even in this talk, I've scratched the surface, but I think even in the published article, which is much longer, I feel I still haven't got to the bottom of it. In other words, what are the elements that are, is it simply about a tension between fragmentation and totality, or between dialogism and universality, or is there more that's happening in the text? Because there are any number of components in the play that I didn't even touch upon today. For example, there's a mystery play at the end, right? Which brings in these kind of allegorical figures of sorrow and laughter. And the poet as well, who inserts himself into the proceedings. There's also a clear sense that Khlebnikov's thinking through different, almost Jungian archetypes on the way to the Nietzschean Übermensch. So there's all sorts of things happening. Khlebnikov is trying to, in a sense, summarize the archetypal history of humankind, right? In order to reach a certain kind of utopian moment. The question is, I guess the problem is this: utopia understood in a kind of narrowly political sense are generally associated with models of closure, right? Totalization and closure. But if we think about it rather in terms of an attitude, the Prinzip Hoffnung, as Ernst Bloch would call it, right? The principle of hope. Then it becomes rather about the production of what he calls cultural surplus, which is always in excess of any political project. And so I want to show how Khlebnikov is at the same time married to a certain kind of totalizing vision, which I do not want to underemphasize. It's there. Khlebnikov is the last of the great, well, perhaps not the last, because Russia's definitely going to produce more, right? And that's the one thing Russia is not short of corrupt politicians and poet prophets. So there is this totalizing image that impulse that comes from poetic prophecy. But I also want to suggest that to a greater extent than many of his contemporaries or predecessors, there is this ability to embrace and try to articulate the heterogeneity of sound itself, right? And of time-space. But he does look to bring it to an end, right? I mean, the point of Khlebnikov's Zangezi and the universal language and the laws of time and space is he says, when you understand this and embrace it, all war will end. There will be no more human suffering, right? So it's the kind of, it's the promise of the second coming. It's that, but without a God and without a Christ. That's what he's looking for. That's the ultimate horizon of Khlebnikov's text. But it's not necessarily realized, in my opinion, in the actual dynamics of the text. I would love to hear more about what you're thinking along these lines, but maybe we can talk later as well. Yes?
Yes, hi, my name is Natasha Kuchano. I've done some studies on Khlebnikov.
Oh, you have?
Yes.
Okay.
and Tatlin-
I hope I didn't misstate or underestimate the
No,
contributions.
no. And Tatlin actually, he went into 3 dimensions, like around the time he met Khlebnikov. Khlebnikov pushed him, his geopoetics, whatever, his poetry, pushed him to
Away from
expand
the
into-
counter reliefs towards.
to 3 dimensions.
I understand. That's true.
He began to do his counter reliefs. And this production in particular was a tribute to him,
Yes.
made after the death
Yes, yes.
of Khlebnikov.
Yes.
So that is completely his effort.
Yes.
But what interests me in this kind of in poetry is that Tatlin kind of hung on, or he saw the spatial kind of dimension of Khlebnikov and the connection to the image, and rather than time, as he said. Because as you probably know, Khlebnikov is terrible at reading his poetry.
Well, he was an incredibly shy man.
He was very shy.
Painfully shy.
So his poetry was not like Mayakovsky.
Yeah, who's the antithesis of Mayakovsky?
He was like the opposite of
Yes.
it. So most of his poetry was like kind of written, like crumpled piece of paper and
Yes,
stuff like that,
yes,
and
yes.
read not really aloud. So it was mostly visual image that was, and I was wondering about the connection of that to sound image, to the formalist concept of sound image that Brick wrote about, and how, Khlebnikov exemplifies it, because Brick wrote about this concept of sound image.
Is it Zvukoobraz?
Yeah, Zvukoobraz.
Zvukoobraz. I read it a long time. I need to go back to that. That's an interesting.
Yeah. And how it's like eliminates time and kind of puts forward the image and the space.
I would, let me just think about it. I haven't, do you remember what book by?
Well, he wrote like
Zvukopovtory.
Well, he wrote like.
I can find it.
Yeah, it's in there.
And does he quote Khlebnikov at all in his? Because he's very much part of the milieu in which Khlebnikov was known. So.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I know that Georgy Vesnin, for example, in Moscow does, various things, various studies on Brick. Yeah.
No, one of the other questions that I haven't figured out yet myself is, Khlebnikov has both a theory of space and a theory of time. And the theory of time is associated with number, and the theory of space is associated with letters, right? So insofar as he's a poet, it's inevitable that the sonic and the spatial have a certain priority. But he's also trying to think time. But because it's harder to integrate numbers into poetry, although he does, right? He constantly starts reciting formulae, like mathematical formulae, and he inserts them into his poems. But they sort of stick out as inorganic elements of the text in some fashion, right? But there is an attempt at fusing the two. But in my opinion, he doesn't come up with a grand theory that reconciles space and time, because that would be about actually reconciling geometry and mathematics and letter and number. So that's the challenge. Yes. Go ahead. Yeah. And then Anne.
My name is Olga. Okay. So you said that he is talking about like second coming, but without God.
Mm-hmm.
But if we remember, in the beginning was
Slower.
God,
Mm-hmm.
and God was with God, and God was God. So probably it's more connection in his imagination, how it's actually it's like stealing word from God. Language and creating language from this word.
So I mean, it remains to be seen. I mean, I think that's a claim that you could make more credibly with respect to Mayakovsky, who is obsessed with the Christian God and with Christ, right? He claims to be an atheist, but he's constantly struggling with the Christian tradition in all of his poetry, right? I would say what's interesting about Khlebnikov, and this is actually what makes him unusual in the Russian tradition, is that, as far as I can remember, there is no mention of Christ in his poetry, or at least not that I can recall, and certainly no deep affective relationship to Christ. There are any number of prophets mentioned, but interestingly they're often Islamic prophets, Zoroaster himself, Zarathustra, and even heretical prophets of the 19th century from Iran. There's almost a conscious, deliberate circumventing of Christianity in Khlebnikov. He will rather talk about the Zulu god Unkulunkulu than Jesus Christ. Why is an interesting question, but I think it has something to do with this kind of alternative universality that he's looking for. Yeah.
Well, this was just to ask you to speculate a little bit. Do you think that his monolingualism was a necessary condition of this kind of thinking? Do you think a multilingual person could even have come up with this sort of fantasy?
When I was a little boy, when I was 12, bored silly in Sydney, Australia, because we had just moved from India, I invented a universal language. But I wanted it to contain all the phonetic possibilities of Hindi, Tamil, English, and a couple of other languages that I was hearing around me. So I think that a multilingual person can come up with a universal language. But it is striking how little...
To believe in its power to this degree seems to me to be what's really unusual. I don't know.
It's an interesting idea, actually. He's obviously uncomfortable in some ways with heteroglossia or with polylingualism.
And I was just going to ask you to go back to what you said you would talk about before, which is Bloch's Dimenatsid and why Christ is there, because you just reminded me of that, talking about why he's not in Khlebnikov at all.
I mean, that's a very controversial question.
Yeah,
Right? There's a large amount of
answer, but you said you would, so I thought you might want to.
Okay, you got me there. So, one way to think about it is the question of whether Christ is leading the 12, right? I mean, for those of you who aren't familiar with the text, it's one of the great texts of Russian poetry of this time, right? And certainly Bloch's most serious and lengthiest and also final engagement, both with Russian poetry and with the Russian Revolution. And of course we find this curious transformation, apparent transformation of the apostles of Christ into the Red Guard, right? Who are clearly neither Christian nor indeed particularly communist. They're basically going rampaging, drinking and raping women in the streets of snowy Petrograd. And what is Jesus doing there? That's the question. It's been widely debated in Russian scholarship. I don't think there's a definitive answer. The simple answer would be that he saw some kind of redemptive possibility in the apparently senseless violence of the Russian Revolution. He had obviously few real illusions about what revolution actually looks like in January of 1918 in Petrograd, which was more like a chaotic bloodbath than any kind of conscious historical process. My question is, when we see Jesus walking ahead of them, is he leading them? Is he fleeing them? Are they actually guarding him rather than following him? So there are any number of, I think, quite deliberately ambiguous possibilities. But I would argue that, I mean, the eschatological or the millenarian paradigm is very strong in Bloch, right? And how to reconcile the millenarian with the decadent is really Bloch's poetic challenge. What's interesting is that I think Khlebnikov abandons decadence altogether, naturally. And even his millenarian model is complicated. Some of you may be aware, Lada Panova has written this massive book in which she claims that in fact Khlebnikov didn't invent anything new. It's a book called Mnimaya sirotstva, which means something like false orphanhood. Right? And the idea is that Khlebnikov actually got everything from these guys, from the symbolists. I think she's wrong. Although, I would have to write another 400-page book to disprove it. My feeling is, in fact, that Khlebnikov is actually doing something, both cognitively and poetically, that is actually quite new, even as he is apparently relying on the past, and including the prophetic traditions.
Thank you.
Ilya?
Yes, Harsha, thank you so much for the rich talk. And I worry that I may not be able to quite articulate the number of things that are happening in my head, or at least one of them I will try. So just to go back to this concrete moment in your presentation where you talk about this dichotomy between the Samavita Slova, self-sufficient word on the one hand, and the poet prophet on the other, right? Which the dichotomy is then sort of mediated by the concept of geopoetics. So one thing that keeps coming up, both in your presentation and in questions and answers, is this, to my mind at least, the thing that keeps coming up is the third term, which might not be, or the fourth term, right, which might not be coincident with either of them, but may be overlapping with all of them potentially, is the concept of system, right, which is part of which is inspired by your references to Russian formalism, right, and part of which is inspired by your invocation of scientism, right, and rationalism, kind of radical rationalism that's here. And what I mean by system is the following, right? So if you take a kind of classical formalist argument, it might go something like this, right? We don't have autonomous poet prophets, right?
But
this is old kind of literary history, right? We don't want to tell that literary history. We have a system of literature, which is part of systems, right?
System within
system of systems, and so on. And that there is a kind of law-like ways in which literary evolution occurs, in which poets are name holders, right, or
for combinations that create systems.
Combinations, right, and Tynyanov on Khlebnikov, among other things, right, is drawing on this argument, at least in part. So on one hand, on the other hand, the Samavita Slova, right, which of course doesn't exist, right, there exists from a certain point of view, it doesn't exist as such as Samavita, right. This is a little bit too positivistic. This is a kind of potentially positivistic kind of strain within formalism itself, right, as if it's possible to just overhear sounds and without context, right, without the ways in which they already fit into a particular kind of linguistic system of differences, right, the Saussureanism comes in. And the way that this kind of starts paying off when you're trying to talk about the revolution, of course, it seems to me, is that it starts raising this whole Freud question of the relationship between laws of history on the one hand and voluntarism. Right? Laws of history
versus
voluntarism, right? Versus this kind of right. Is there a magu, right, or is there a dolzhen, right? And what is the relationship between the magu and the dolzhen in Khlebnikov, right? And whether or not.
No, you're raising some. I mean, in a sense, Khlebnikov would believes that he's simply discovering an objective set of laws that actually inhere in time, space, and language, right? So that is the difference between a poet and a prophet, if you will, right? A poet can claim to have imagined, but a prophet is simply a receptacle for an utterance that emerges from elsewhere, formally from the divine, right? But for Khlebnikov, from the inherent properties of time, space, and of language itself. So in that sense, I think Khlebnikov would be happy to agree with you that there are systems that are objective and inherent in something like human or planetary history, and that he's simply unearthing them and making them available. So that would be the aspect that would be systemic. My argument, however, is that particularly in the Lewis Carroll type verse that I quoted at the end, right, the Jabberwocky analogy, is that already begins to produce certain kinds of excess that can't be contained readily within the system, and that is really about the pleasure of the signifier, if you will, right, in the Barthian sense, and which is also for him connected to some notion of utopian harmony, right? So it's not, which is not necessarily, which can't be entirely codified.
I guess. Sorry. So maybe to clarify it a little bit in more vivid terms, is there a poet sitting on top, right? In other words, the idea, where is totality coming from? Is it coming from the figure of the subject, or is there no, in fact, autonomous subject, right? And this question gets picked up then in the 20th century, obviously, in all sorts of complicated ways in theory, right? So I wonder where he would end, because he seems like he might be somewhere in the
So if you compare him to, say, Mayakovsky, Mayakovsky and Khlebnikov are the two great poets of the revolution, but if you compare his I in the sense of right, his ego or his self to Mayakovsky's, Mayakovsky, there's so many figures like Jakobson, Trotsky, Tsvetaeva pointed out, essentially magnifies and expands his self and becomes, so there's a kind of myacomorphism of that as, I think that was Trotsky's term, right? Myacomorphism. Where the entire world becomes absorbed into the expanded ego, the cosmic ego of Mayakovsky. Khlebnikov doesn't really do that, right? He projects multiple selves, but ultimately I think he sees his role as being that of a poet-prophet whose role will be abolished, or at least superseded, by the laws that he is willing to share with everybody in this room, right? So once he dies and I leave this room, the laws of time and space will continue to reverberate in the Jordan Center, and it's up to all of you to embrace them in order to create a perfect universe.
And on that wonderful note, you should embrace the laws of time and space.